Brewing Storm Clouds.
France, 1918.
Isabel Hartley sat by the edge of a trench, exhausted and grieving. Then, as the wind shifted, she heard her name, spoken softly, carried through the air. Isabel. She turned, heart pounding. No one was there, but in the dirt beside her, freshly scrawled, was Samuel Hayes' name. Chapter 1. The Whisper on the Wind. The air hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blend of damp earth, cordite, and the ever-present, cloying sweetness of decay. Isabel Hartley sat slumped against the muddy wall of the trench, her shoulders shaking with a grief so profound it threatened to swallow her whole. Her fingers, stiff and stained with the grime of the battlefield, traced the rough canvas of her nurse's uniform. Just hours ago, this section of the trench near Amiens had been a maelstrom of chaos, a relentless barrage of German shells, the screams of the wounded, the frantic scramble for survival. Now, an eerie silence had descended, a silence more terrifying than the cacophony of war. She closed her eyes. The image of her younger brother, Thomas, burned into her mind. Thomas, with his mischievous grin and boundless optimism, now lay lifeless in the makeshift morgue tent, another casualty of this senseless war. He'd been caught in the open during the shelling, a piece of shrapnel tearing through his young life with brutal efficiency. Isabel had held his hand as the light faded from his eyes, his last word a whispered. Isabel, a sob escaped her lips, a raw, guttural sound that was quickly swallowed by the vast emptiness of the battlefield. She felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of sorrow and despair. The war had taken everything from her father, lost at the Somme 2 years prior, her fiancé, reported missing in action near Ypres last spring, and now, Thomas. What was left? The wind, a relentless, mournful presence, whipped through the trench, carrying with it the whispers of the dead and the chilling premonition of more loss to come. Isabel shivered, pulling her threadbare shawl tighter around her. She felt a presence, a subtle shift in the air, as if someone were standing close by. And then she heard it. A voice, faint as a breath, carried on the wind. Isabel, her head snapped up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She scanned the trench, her eyes darting from one muddy corner to another. Nothing. Only the ravaged earth, the scattered debris of battle, and the oppressive silence. She must be imagining things, the stress and grief finally taking their toll. Hallucinations were common enough among those who witnessed the horrors of the front line. But then, her gaze fell upon something in the dirt beside her, something that hadn't been there moments before. A name, freshly scrawled into the mud, the letters still damp and glistening. Samuel Hayes. The name sent a jolt through her, a strange mixture of fear and a flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Samuel Hayes. She knew the name. It was etched in her memory, linked to a painful chapter of her past. A chapter she had tried desperately to bury. He was an American officer, a surgeon, assigned to a field hospital near her father's regiment. A man she'd met briefly, years ago, before the war had consumed everything. A man with kind eyes and a gentle touch. A man who had held her hand, much like she'd held Thomas's, as her father drew his last breath. A memory of shared sorrow, a fleeting connection forged in the crucible of loss. Why his name? Why now? Was it a message? A sign? Or simply another cruel trick of her grief-addled mind? She reached out, her finger tracing the outline of his name in the mud. The earth was cold and damp beneath her touch. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trench, scattering dust and debris, and momentarily obscuring the name. When the wind died down, the name was still there, stark and undeniable. Isabel stood up, her legs shaky, her mind racing. She had to find out. She had to know if it was real, if Samuel Hayes was somehow here, on this desolate battlefield. The thought, however improbable, ignited a spark of hope within her, a tiny flame flickering in the darkness of her despair. It was a dangerous hope, a fragile hope, but it was all she had left. She started to walk, her boots sinking into the mud with each step, her eyes scanning the horizon. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows across the ravaged landscape, painting the sky in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. The air was growing colder, the wind sharper. But she pressed on, driven by a desperate need to find an answer, to unravel the mystery of the whispered name and the impossible presence it suggested. The war had taken so much, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was about to give something back. Or perhaps it was setting another trap, another cruel twist of fate waiting to shatter what little remained of her heart. She didn't know, but she had to find out. The wind howled. The name remained. Chapter 2.
Ghosts of Amiens.
The walk back to the field hospital was a blur. Isabel moved like a ghost herself, navigating the labyrinthine network of trenches and shell-pocked roads, her mind consumed by the name etched in the mud. Samuel Hayes. The image of his face, hazy with the passage of time, flickered in her memory, the deep-set, compassionate eyes, the strong jawline softened by a hint of weariness, the way his lips had curved into a gentle smile, even amidst the grim reality of her father's dying moments. The field hospital, a collection of tents and hastily erected wooden structures, was a scene of controlled chaos. The wounded continued to arrive, carried on stretchers, their faces contorted with pain, their bodies mangled by the relentless machinery of war. The air reeked of antiseptic, blood, and the acrid smell of burning fabric from the nearby incinerator, where they disposed of amputated limbs. Isabel moved through the familiar scene with a detached efficiency, her years of experience as a nurse allowing her to function almost on autopilot. She checked on patients, changed dressings, administered morphine, her hands moving with practiced skill while her mind remained preoccupied with the mystery of Samuel's name. She sought out Madame Dubois, the head nurse, a formidable woman with a sharp tongue and a heart of gold, who had been a mentor and a friend to Isabel since she'd first arrived at the hospital. Madame Dubois was in the operating tent, her sleeves rolled up, assisting the surgeons in a desperate attempt to save a young soldier whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. Isabel waited patiently, her gaze fixed on the flickering lantern light that spilled out from the tent, casting dancing shadows on the canvas walls. The sounds of muffled voices, the clink of surgical instruments, and the occasional groan of pain filled the air. Finally, Madame Dubois emerged, wiping her brow with the back of her hand, her face etched with fatigue. "Isabel," she said, her voice hoarse, "you look like you've seen a ghost."
What is it?
Isabel hesitated, unsure how to explain the strange occurrence in the trench. "Madame Dubois," she began, her voice trembling slightly, Do you know of an American surgeon, a Samuel Hayes?" Madame Dubois's eyebrows rose. "Hayes? Yes, I believe I've heard the name. He was attached to the American Expeditionary Forces, I think. A skilled surgeon from what I hear. Why do you ask?" Isabel took a deep breath. "I saw his name, written in the mud. Near where Thomas," she couldn't finish the sentence, the pain of her brother's death still too raw. Madame Dubois's expression softened. She placed a hand on Isabel's arm, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Isabel, my dear, you're exhausted. Grief can play tricks on the mind. You've been through so much." "But it was so real," Isabel insisted, her voice rising slightly. "I know it sounds impossible, but I felt him. I heard him whisper my name." Madame Dubois sighed. "There have been rumors of American units moving into the sector," she said slowly. "It's possible he's here. But the chances of it being him, writing his name in the mud, it's slim. Isabel. Very slim. But I have to know," Isabel said, her eyes pleading. "Please, Madame Dubois, can you help me find out if he's here?" Madame Dubois studied Isabel's face, her gaze filled with a mixture of concern and pity. She knew the pain of loss, the desperate yearning for a connection, for something to hold on to in the face of overwhelming despair. She had seen it countless times in the eyes of the young nurses who came to the front, hoping to make a difference, only to be confronted with the brutal reality of war. "All right, Isabel," she said finally, "I'll make some inquiries. But don't get your hopes up, my dear. This war, it changes people. Even if it is him, he may not be the man you remember." The warning hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder of the transformative power of war. But Isabel refused to be deterred. She had to find out the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The whisper on the wind, the name in the mud, it was a thread, a fragile connection to a past that might offer a glimmer of hope in the present, or crush her with a truth she couldn't bear. The ghosts of Amiens were restless tonight, and one, in particular, seemed determined to speak. Chapter 3. The Scars He Carried. The next few days were a torment of waiting and uncertainty. Madame Dubois, true to her word, made inquiries through her network of contacts, other nurses, medical officers, even a few well-placed supply sergeants who seemed to know everything that happened within a 50-mile radius. But information was scarce and unreliable, filtered through layers of military bureaucracy and the ever-present fog of war. Isabel continued her duties at the hospital, trying to focus on the immediate needs of the wounded, but her mind was constantly elsewhere. She found herself scanning the faces of every new arrival, searching for a familiar pair of eyes, a familiar curve of the jaw. She jumped at every whispered conversation, every mention of an American unit. One evening, as she was sitting by the bedside of a young soldier who had lost his sight in a gas attack, Madame Dubois approached her, a small, folded piece of paper in her hand. "Isabel," she said quietly, "I have some news. It seems your Samuel Hayes is indeed in this sector. He's attached to a mobile surgical unit, operating closer to the front lines." Isabel's heart leaped with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. He was here. He was real. But the words "closer to the front lines" sent a shiver of fear down her spine. It meant he was in constant danger, exposed to the full fury of the war. "Do you know where exactly?" Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Madame Dubois shook her head. "The information is vague. Military movements are kept secret for obvious reasons. But there's a supply depot about 5 miles from here, near the village of Cuero. They often serve as a relay point for mobile units. You might find someone there who knows more." Isabel felt a surge of determination. 5 miles. It was a long distance, especially in these conditions, but it was within reach. She had to go. She had to see him. "Thank you, Madame Dubois," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. I don't know how to repay you." "Just be careful, Isabel," Madame Dubois said, her eyes filled with concern. "The roads are dangerous.
And be prepared.
He may not be the man you remember." Isabel nodded, her mind already racing with plans. She would go at dawn, under the cover of darkness. She would find a way to reach Cuero, to find Samuel Hayes. The next morning, as the first rays of light began to paint the eastern sky, Isabel slipped out of the hospital, her heart pounding in her chest. She had managed to secure a ride on a supply truck heading in the direction of Cuero, a risky proposition, but one she was willing to take. The journey was a harrowing one, the truck bumping and swaying along the rutted, shell-pocked roads. The air was thick with the smell of diesel fumes and the ever-present scent of decay. They passed through deserted villages, their buildings reduced to rubble, their streets eerily silent. The landscape was a testament to the destructive power of war, a stark reminder of the dangers that lay ahead. As they approached Cuero, Isabel saw a cluster of tents and vehicles in the distance, a telltale sign of a military encampment. Her heart beat faster. This was it. She thanked the driver, a gruff, taciturn man who seemed unfazed by the surrounding devastation, and stepped down from the truck, her legs stiff and aching. She approached the encampment cautiously, her eyes scanning the faces of the soldiers milling about. She saw American uniforms, heard American voices. She approached a group of soldiers huddled around a fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "Excuse me," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm looking for a surgeon. Dr. Samuel Hayes. Do you know him?" The soldiers looked at her, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. One of them, a young man with a bandage around his head, nodded slowly. "Hayes. Yeah, I know him. He's around here somewhere. He patched me up a few days ago." "Good doc." Isabel's heart soared. He was here.
He was close.
"Do you know where I might find him?" she asked. The soldier pointed towards a large tent at the edge of the encampment. He's probably in there. That's the operating tent. But be warned. He's not the same. The war, it's changed him. The words echoed Madame Dubois's warning, a chilling reminder of the toll the war had taken on everyone. But Isabelle was undeterred. She had come this far. She had to see him, no matter what. She approached the tent, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sounds of activity inside, muffled voices, the clink of instruments. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the canvas flap. Then, taking a deep breath, she pulled it open and stepped inside. The scene that greeted her was one of organized chaos. Doctors and nurses, their faces masked, their gowns stained with blood, worked feverishly over wounded soldiers lying on makeshift operating tables. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. And then she saw him. Across the room, his back to her, bent over a patient. He was taller than she remembered, his shoulders broader, his hair streaked with gray. But there was something in the way he moved, in the gentle way he touched the wounded soldier, that was undeniably familiar. She took a step forward, her voice catching in her throat. "Samuel?" she whispered. He didn't react at first. He continued to work, his hands moving with practiced precision. Then slowly he straightened up and turned around. Their eyes met, and Isabelle saw the scars. Not just the physical ones, the lines etched around his eyes, the faint scar on his cheek, but the deeper ones, the ones that haunted his gaze, the ones that spoke of unimaginable horrors and unspeakable loss. He was different, but he was still Samuel. The whisper had led her to him, but the reunion was far more complex than she could have ever imagined. Chapter 4. Letters Never Sent. His eyes, once filled with a warmth that had comforted her during her father's final moments, now held a distant, haunted look. They widened slightly in recognition, but the flicker of familiarity was quickly replaced by a guarded expression, a wall built between them and the world. "Isabelle?" he said, his voice raspy, almost a whisper. It was a voice that had seen too much, endured too much. She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. She wanted to rush to him, to embrace him, to bridge the gap that had formed between them, but something in his stance, in the way he held himself, kept her rooted to the spot. What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice laced with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. "I saw your name," she stammered, her voice trembling. "In the mud. Near where my brother," she couldn't finish the sentence. The memory of Thomas's lifeless body still too raw, too painful. Samuel's expression softened slightly, a flicker of compassion crossing his face. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "about your brother. This war, it takes so much from us. But how did your name get there?" Isabelle persisted, her voice gaining strength. Did you write it?" He hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting away from hers. I don't know," he said finally. "I've been having these episodes. Moments of disorientation. I don't always remember what I do." His words sent a chill down Isabelle's spine. The war had not only scarred him physically and emotionally, but it had also fractured his mind, leaving him with gaps in his memory, lost moments in time. "But you were there?" she asked, her voice pleading. "Near that trench?" He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "We were operating nearby. A few days ago. There was heavy shelling. We lost a lot of men." The words hung heavy in the air, a stark reminder of the constant danger that surrounded them. Isabelle looked around the tent, at the wounded soldiers, at the exhausted faces of the medical staff. She saw the toll the war was taking on everyone, the physical and emotional wounds that would likely never fully heal. I heard you whisper my name," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On the wind." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "I don't remember," he said. "But I've been thinking about you, Isabelle. Ever since your father. I never forgot you." The admission, though hesitant, sent a wave of warmth through Isabelle. He remembered her. He had thought of her. It was a small spark of hope in the darkness, a fragile connection that had somehow survived the years and the horrors of war. "I have letters," she blurted out, surprising even herself. Letters she had poured her heart and soul into, writing to him as a form of therapy, a way to cope with the losses she had endured. Letters she had never sent, fearing rejection, fearing the truth of what he might have become. "Letters I wrote to you. I never mailed them." He looked surprised, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "Letters?"
he said.
"Why didn't you send them?" "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice trembling. "Afraid of what you might think. Afraid of opening up old wounds." She looked down at her hands, twisting them nervously. "Afraid you wouldn't remember me, Dad, or that the war had changed you completely." He took a step closer, his gaze softening. "Isabel," he said, his voice gentle, "the war has changed me. It's changed all of us. But it hasn't erased my memories. It hasn't erased you." He reached out, his hand hovering hesitantly over hers, before finally making contact. His touch was warm, reassuring. "I want to read them. Your letters. If you'll let me." A wave of relief washed over Isabel. She had found him, and even amidst the scars and the trauma, there was a flicker of the man she remembered, a spark of connection that had defied the odds. The letters, unsent and filled with unspoken emotions, suddenly held the promise of bridging the gap, of revealing the hidden depths of their shared experience, of forging a new understanding in the crucible of war. But would those letters bring them closer, or reveal a chasm too wide to cross? The uncertainty remained, a heavy weight on her heart. Chapter 5. The Rendezvous at Dawn. The decision to share the letters was a turning point, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of war and trauma. But the logistics of their situation presented an immediate challenge. Samuel's duties kept him constantly on the move, responding to the ebb and flow of the front line, while Isabel was bound to her responsibilities at the field hospital. Stolen moments, brief encounters in the chaos of the war, were all they could hope for. "There's a small, abandoned church," Samuel said, his voice low, his eyes searching hers, "about a mile west of here. It's relatively safe. We could meet there. At dawn. Before my unit moves out." The suggestion sent a shiver of both excitement and fear down Isabel's spine. A rendezvous, a secret meeting, in a war-torn landscape. It was dangerous, reckless even, but the pull of their connection, the need to understand each other, to share the burden of their experiences, was too strong to resist. "I'll be there," she said, her voice firm, her heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, as the first hint of light began to creep over the horizon, Isabel slipped away from the hospital, her movements cloaked in the pre-dawn darkness. She walked quickly, her boots crunching on the frozen ground, the air cold and crisp against her face. The landscape was eerily silent, the usual sounds of war, the distant rumble of artillery, the crackle of gunfire momentarily subdued. She found the church easily, a small, stone structure, its roof partially collapsed, its windows shattered, its walls scarred by shrapnel. It was a desolate sight, a testament to the destructive power of war, but it also offered a strange sense of sanctuary, a refuge from the chaos and carnage. Samuel was already there, waiting for her, his figure silhouetted against the faint light filtering through the broken windows. He was leaning against a crumbling wall, his hands thrust deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on the horizon. As she approached, he turned, his eyes meeting hers. He looked tired, his face drawn and pale, but there was a softness in his expression, a vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. "Isabel," he said, his voice a quiet murmur, "you came." "Of course," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I said I would." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. The faint light of dawn illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the shattered remnants of stained glass windows, the crumbling altar. Isabel pulled the bundle of letters from her bag, her hands shaking slightly. These are the letters," she said, holding them out to him. I don't know what to expect. I wrote them at different times. When I was feeling lost. When I needed to talk to you." He took the letters, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of electricity through her. He held them gently, almost reverently, as if they were sacred objects. "Thank you, Isabel," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for sharing these with me,
For trusting me."
He sat down on a broken pew, the letters in his lap, and began to read. Isabel sat beside him, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze fixed on his face. She watched as his eyes moved across the pages, his expression shifting from curiosity to surprise to a deep, profound sadness. The silence of the ruined church was broken only by the rustling of the paper, the occasional sigh from Samuel, and the distant rumble of artillery, a constant reminder of the war that raged just beyond the walls of their temporary sanctuary. As he read, Isabel saw tears welling up in his eyes, tracing a path down his weathered cheeks. She reached out, her hand hesitantly touching his arm, offering a silent gesture of comfort and support. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "Isabel," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "these letters, they're beautiful. And heartbreaking. I had no idea. About your brother. About everything you've been through. I needed you to know," she said, her voice trembling. "I needed someone to understand." He closed his eyes for a moment, his hand covering hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "I understand," he said softly. "More than you know." The dawn light grew stronger, illuminating the interior of the church, revealing the full extent of the damage, the scars of war etched into every stone, every broken beam. But within that ruined sanctuary, a connection was being forged, a bond strengthened by shared grief, by unspoken understanding, by the fragile hope of a future that seemed impossibly distant, yet tantalizingly real. The rendezvous was a success, but the true test of their connection was yet to come. The letters had opened a door, but what lay beyond was still shrouded in the uncertainty of war. Chapter 6. A Promise Under Fire. The shared intimacy of the ruined church, the raw emotions laid bare by Isabel's letters, created a fragile bond between them. But the realities of war were inescapable. Samuel's unit was ordered to move further east, towards a sector where the fighting was particularly intense. The promise of another rendezvous felt precarious, a wish whispered into the wind. "I don't know when I'll be able to see you again," Samuel said, his voice tight with regret, as they stood outside the church, the morning sun casting long shadows across the ravaged landscape. "We're moving closer to the front. It's going to be bad." Isabel felt a familiar wave of fear wash over her. She had become accustomed to the constant anxiety, the ever-present threat of loss, but the thought of Samuel being in even greater danger filled her with a dread she couldn't ignore. "Be careful," she said, her voice trembling, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Please be careful." He covered her hand with his grip firm and reassuring. "I will," he said. "I promise you. I have something to live for now." His words, simple yet profound, sent a surge of warmth through her, a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. She looked into his eyes, saw the haunted look, the weariness, but also saw something else, a determination, a resolve that she hadn't seen before. "I'll be waiting," she said, her voice stronger now, her gaze unwavering. "No matter how long it takes." They stood there for a moment, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a silent exchange of promises, of hopes, of fears. The distant rumble of artillery, the ever-present reminder of the war, seemed to fade into the background, overshadowed by the intensity of their connection. Suddenly, a shout broke the silence. "Captain Hayes! We're moving out." Samuel's grip tightened on Isabel's hand for a brief moment, then he reluctantly let go. "I have to go," he said, his voice filled with regret. "But I'll find you, Isabel. I promise." He turned and walked away, his figure disappearing quickly into the ranks of soldiers preparing to depart. Isabel watched him go, her heart aching with a mixture of longing and fear. She stood there, alone in the desolate landscape, the echoes of his promise ringing in her ears. The following days were a blur of activity at the field hospital. The casualties mounted, the wounded arriving in ever-increasing numbers, their bodies bearing the horrific marks of the intensifying conflict. Isabel worked tirelessly, her days and nights blending together, her mind constantly preoccupied with thoughts of Samuel. She clung to his promise, to the memory of their shared moments in the ruined church, as a lifeline, a source of strength in the face of overwhelming despair. She found herself rereading her own letters, the ones she had shared with him, finding comfort in the words she had written, in the emotions she had poured onto the page. One evening, as she was sitting by the bedside of a young soldier, a runner arrived with a message. "Nurse Hartley?" he said, his voice breathless. "A message for you. From Captain Hayes." Isabel's heart leaped with excitement. A message. He had found a way to reach her. She took the small, folded piece of paper, her hands trembling, and unfolded it carefully. The message was brief, written in Samuel's familiar scrawl. "Under fire. Thinking of you. Church.
Dawn.
If possible. S.H." The words sent a shiver of both fear and exhilaration down her spine. Under fire. He was in the thick of it, facing unimaginable dangers. But he was thinking of her. And he wanted to see her again. The risk was immense. The journey to the church, through the war-torn landscape, was perilous. But Isabel knew she had to go. She had to see him, to know that he was alive, to offer whatever comfort and support she could. The next morning, as the first hint of light began to paint the eastern sky, she set out once again, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with a mixture of hope and dread. The promise made under fire was a testament to their connection, a fragile thread of hope stretched taut across the battlefield. But would it hold? Would they meet again? Or would the war finally tear them apart? Chapter 7. The Betrayal at Bapaume. The journey to the church was fraught with peril. The roads, already treacherous, were now subject to sporadic shelling, and the air was thick with the tension of impending battle. Isabel, having secured a ride on a munitions truck, huddled low in the back, her heart pounding with every explosion, every rattle of the vehicle. She arrived at the church just as the first rays of dawn were breaking through the clouds, casting an eerie, golden light on the ruined structure. She scanned the area, her eyes searching for any sign of Samuel. He wasn't there. A wave of disappointment washed over her, followed by a surge of fear. Had something happened? Had he been injured? Or worse? She waited, her anxiety growing with each passing minute. The silence of the church, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery, was oppressive, suffocating. Suddenly, she heard a noise, the sound of footsteps, approaching from the rear of the church. She turned, her heart leaping with hope, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, silver crucifix she wore around her neck, a gift from her mother. But it wasn't Samuel. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a British uniform, his face obscured by the dim light. He was tall and imposing, his stance suggesting authority and a hint of menace. "Nurse Hartley?" he said, his voice cold and clipped, his accent distinctly British. "Yes," Isabel replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Who are you?" "Captain Alistair Davies," he said, stepping closer, his eyes scanning her face with a chilling intensity. "Military intelligence. I'm here to ask you a few questions." Isabel's heart sank. Military intelligence. This wasn't good. "Questions?" she said, her voice barely a whisper. "About what?" "About Captain Samuel Hayes," Davies said, his gaze unwavering. "You've been seen with him. You've been communicating with him. We have reason to believe he's not who he seems." The words hit Isabel like a physical blow. Not who he seems. What did that mean? A wave of confusion and disbelief washed over her. I don't understand," she stammered. "Captain Hayes is a surgeon. An American officer. He's a spy." "Nurse Hartley," Davies interrupted, his voice sharp and accusing. "Working for the Germans. We've been tracking him for weeks. And you've been aiding and abetting him." The accusation was so outrageous, so preposterous, that Isabel almost laughed.
Samuel?
A spy? It was impossible. She knew him. She had read his heart in her letters. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the scars of war that he carried. That's ridiculous, she said, her voice rising in indignation. You're wrong. You have to be wrong. Davies smiled, a cold, humorless smile that sent a shiver down her spine. We have proof, Nurse Hartley, he said. Intercepted messages. Eyewitness accounts. And your letters. The ones you so conveniently shared with him. The letters. The realization hit Isabel like a thunderbolt. The letters, filled with her most intimate thoughts and feelings, had been used against her, against Samuel. She had been betrayed, not by Samuel, but by her own vulnerability, by her own desperate need for connection. The letters, they don't prove anything, she said, her voice trembling, her mind racing. They're personal. They're about loss, about grief. They're about coded messages, Nurse Hartley, Davies said, his voice hardening. Messages passed between you and your lover. Messages that have cost the lives of Allied soldiers. The accusation was a lie, a cruel and deliberate distortion of the truth. But Isabel knew, in that moment, that she was trapped. She had unwittingly become a pawn in a deadly game, a game she didn't understand, a game she couldn't possibly win. Bapaume, a nearby town, was where Samuel's unit was supposedly headed. It was also a strategic location, a key battleground in the ongoing conflict. The betrayal, orchestrated by Davies and his intelligence unit, was designed to trap Samuel, to use Isabel as bait. But the consequences were far greater than she could have ever imagined. The weight of the accusation, the realization of her unwitting role in this deadly game, left her reeling. What had she done? And what would happen to Samuel? Chapter 8. Whispers of espionage. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Isabel stared at Captain Davies, the British intelligence officer, his words echoing in the ruined church like a death knell.
Spy.
Betrayal. Coded messages. It was a nightmare unfolding, a reality so twisted and cruel it felt impossible to grasp. You're lying, Isabel said, her voice shaking but filled with a desperate conviction. Samuel would never. He's a good man. A doctor. He saves lives. Davies smirked, a chilling expression that sent a wave of fear through her. Sentimentality is a dangerous weakness in wartime, Nurse Hartley. Your good man has been playing a very clever game. And you, my dear, have been his most valuable asset. He produced a small, leather-bound book, her journal, the one in which she had kept her letters to Samuel. He opened it, flipping through the pages, stopping at a seemingly random entry. Listen to this, Davies said, reading aloud in a mocking tone. The roses in the garden are wilting, their petals falling like tears. The old oak tree stands strong, but its branches are bare. He looked up at Isabel, his eyes glinting with malice. Roses. Oak. Code words, Nurse Hartley. Signals to his German contacts. Telling them about troop movements, supply routes. You've been sending information, unknowingly perhaps, that led to ambushes and the loss of numerous soldiers on the Western Front. Isabel felt a cold dread creep into her heart. Her innocent words, expressions of her grief and longing, twisted into something sinister, something deadly. She had been so careful, so focused on her own emotional turmoil, that she had failed to see the potential for misinterpretation, the vulnerability of her words in the hands of someone determined to find conspiracy. No, she whispered, shaking her head. That's not what I meant. It was just about my feelings. About the war. Feelings, Davies scoffed. Feelings don't win wars, Nurse Hartley. Information does. And you, my dear, have provided plenty of it. He closed the journal with a snap, the sound echoing in the silence of the church. You'll be coming with me, he said, his voice cold and commanding. We have a lot more to discuss. Isabel felt a surge of panic. She was trapped, caught in a web of lies and deceit. She had to escape, to warn Samuel, to expose the truth.
But how?
She was surrounded by enemies, outnumbered, outmaneuvered. Where are you taking me? She asked, her voice trembling. To a place where you can't do any more harm, Davies replied, his eyes narrowing. To Bapaume, where your lover is conveniently stationed. We'll let him come to you. And then we'll see how loyal he really is. The mention of Bapaume sent a fresh wave of fear through Isabel. It was a trap, a carefully orchestrated plan to capture Samuel, to use her as bait. She had to think, to find a way to warn him, to prevent the inevitable disaster. As Davies led her out of the church, his hand gripping her arm tightly, Isabel's mind raced. She scanned the surroundings, searching for any opportunity, any sign of hope. She saw a group of soldiers in the distance, their uniforms American. A flicker of hope ignited within her. She stumbled, deliberately, falling to her knees, her hand reaching out as if to break her fall. My ankle, she cried out, her voice filled with feigned pain. Davies cursed, his grip tightening on her arm. Get up, he said, his voice harsh. We haven't got time for this. But Isabel remained on the ground, her eyes fixed on the approaching American soldiers. She took a deep breath and screamed, her voice piercing the morning air. Samuel, help me. He's a spy. Davies clamped his hand over her mouth, silencing her. But it was too late. The American soldiers had heard her. They rushed towards them, their weapons drawn, their expressions filled with confusion and alarm. The whispers of espionage had turned into a shout, a desperate cry for help. But whether it was enough to save Samuel, or herself, remained to be seen. The trap had been sprung, and the consequences were about to unfold in the heart of the war-torn landscape. Chapter 9. The Hospital of Broken Hearts. The arrival of the American soldiers created a momentary chaos, a standoff between the British and American forces, fueled by Isabel's desperate accusation and Davies's insistence on her arrest. The air crackled with tension, the threat of violence hanging heavy in the pre-dawn light. What's going on here? One of the American soldiers, a sergeant, demanded, his eyes fixed on Davies, his hand hovering over his weapon. This woman is under arrest, Davies said, his voice tight with authority. She's a collaborator, working with a German spy. A spy? The sergeant said, his eyebrows raising.
Who are you talking about?
Captain Samuel Hayes, Davies said, his gaze shifting to Isabel, his eyes filled with a chilling warning.
Hello.
And a traitor to the Allied cause. The American soldiers exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of confusion and disbelief. They knew Hayes. He was their surgeon, a man who had saved countless lives, a man who had earned their respect and loyalty. Hayes?
A spy?
The sergeant said, shaking his head. That's hard to believe. He's one of the best we've got. He's a clever one, Davies said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He's fooled you all. But we have proof. This woman, she's been his accomplice. Isabel, still held captive by Davies, struggled to speak, her voice muffled by his hand. She managed to pull his hand away, her eyes pleading with the American soldiers. He's lying, she cried out. Samuel is innocent. He's being framed. This man, he's using me to trap him. The sergeant looked from Isabel to Davies, his expression hardening. Let her go, he said to Davies.
We'll sort this out ourselves.
Davies hesitated, his grip tightening on Isabel's arm. He knew he was losing control, that his carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling. But he couldn't back down now. This is a matter of British intelligence, he said, his voice rising in anger. You have no authority here. We have authority over our own men, the sergeant retorted, his hand moving to his weapon. And Hayes is one of ours. Now, let her go. The standoff reached a breaking point. The American soldiers raised their weapons, their fingers on the triggers, their eyes locked on Davies. The threat of violence was palpable, the tension almost unbearable. Finally, Davies relented, his hand releasing Isabel's arm. He knew he was outnumbered, outgunned. He had underestimated the loyalty of the American soldiers to their own. You'll regret this, he said, his voice filled with venom. You're protecting a traitor. And you'll all pay the price. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows, leaving Isabel standing there, trembling, surrounded by the American soldiers. The sergeant approached her, his expression softening. "Are you all right, ma'am?" he asked. Isabel nodded, her voice still shaky. "Yes," she said. "Thank you. You saved me. And Samuel." The sergeant looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and suspicion. "We'll get you back to the hospital," he said. "And we'll find Hayes. We'll get to the bottom of this." They took her back to the American Mobile Surgical Unit, the one where Samuel was stationed. It was a scene of controlled chaos, the wounded arriving in a steady stream, the medical staff working tirelessly to save lives. But Samuel wasn't there. "Where is he?" Isabel asked, her voice filled with panic. "Where's Captain Hayes?" "He was called away," one of the nurses said.
En urgent message.
Something about a meeting. Near Bapaume.
Bapaume.
The trap. Isabel's heart sank. Davies had anticipated their actions, had lured Samuel into a dangerous situation. She had to warn him, to find a way to reach him before it was too late. The whispers of betrayal and the accusations had created a chaotic situation. Now, they were racing against time, heading towards the very trap that had been set, turning the hospital of healing into a place of broken hearts and shattered trust. Chapter 10. Stolen Moments in Peril. The news of Samuel's departure for Bapaume sent a wave of icy dread through Isabel. The trap had been sprung, and she was powerless to stop it. But she refused to give up hope. She had to find a way to reach him, to warn him of the danger that awaited him. "I have to go," she said to the American sergeant, her voice filled with urgency. "I have to warn him. He's walking into a trap." The sergeant hesitated, his expression filled with concern. "It's too dangerous, ma'am," he said. "Bapaume is a war zone. You'll never make it." "I have to try," Isabel insisted, her eyes pleading. "He's innocent. He's being framed. I'm the only one who can." She didn't finish, knowing how weak her argument sounded, knowing the risk she was taking. The sergeant studied her face, saw the desperation in her eyes, the unwavering determination. He knew he couldn't stop her. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of soldiers heading into battle, in the eyes of loved ones facing impossible odds. "All right," he said finally. "But you're not going alone. I'll send a couple of men with you. They know the area. They'll get you as close as they can." Isabel felt a surge of gratitude. It was a small chance, a desperate gamble, but it was better than nothing. She would risk everything to save Samuel, to repay the debt she felt she owed him, to prove his innocence. They set off immediately, a small group of 4 Isabel and 2 American soldiers, armed and determined, heading towards Bapaume in a battered jeep, the landscape around them growing increasingly desolate and dangerous. The sounds of war intensified, the distant rumble of artillery growing louder, the crackle of gunfire closer. They reached the outskirts of Bapaume, a town ravaged by war, its buildings reduced to rubble, its streets littered with debris. The air was thick with smoke and the stench of death. It was a scene of utter devastation, a testament to the brutal reality of the conflict. "We can't go any further by vehicle," one of the soldiers said. "It's too risky. We'll have to go on foot." They abandoned the jeep and proceeded cautiously, moving through the ruined streets, their senses on high alert, their weapons ready. They encountered pockets of resistance, sporadic gunfire from snipers hidden in the rubble, but they managed to avoid any major confrontations. They found the location where Samuel was supposed to be meeting his contact, a deserted warehouse on the edge of town. It was a perfect ambush point, a place where he would be vulnerable, exposed. "He's not here," one of the soldiers said, his voice low, his eyes scanning the surroundings. "We're too late." Isabel felt a wave of despair. Had they missed him? Had Davies already captured him? Or worse? She refused to believe it. She had to keep searching, to find some sign, some clue. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint cry, coming from inside the warehouse. She rushed towards the building, her heart pounding in her chest, her senses on high alert. She found him in a back room, tied to a chair, his face bruised and bloodied, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and defiance. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from surprise to relief to a desperate warning.
"Isabel,"
he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Get out of here." "It's a trap." But it was too late. A figure emerged from the shadows, a familiar figure, his face twisted in a cruel smile. Captain Davies. "Well, well, well," Davies said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look who's decided to join the party. The faithful nurse." Right on cue. He had anticipated their arrival, had used Samuel as bait to lure Isabel into his trap. The stolen moments, the desperate attempt to save him, had led them directly into the heart of the danger. The peril was real, and the consequences were about to unfold. Chapter 11. The Weight of a Secret. Davies's presence confirmed Isabel's worst fears. He had orchestrated the entire scenario, manipulating events, using her and Samuel as pawns in his twisted game. The warehouse, the supposed meeting, the intercepted messages, all part of a carefully constructed web of deceit. "You're a monster," Isabel said, her voice trembling with anger and fear, her eyes fixed on Davies. "You're framing an innocent man. You're using me as for your own." She struggled to find the word, the scope of his betrayal too vast, too cruel to comprehend. Davies chuckled, a cold, humorless sound that sent a shiver down her spine. "Sentimentality. Nurse Hartley," he said, repeating his earlier words, his voice mocking. "A dangerous weakness, especially in wartime." He approached Samuel, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his eyes glinting with malice. "Your loyalty has been touching, Captain Hayes," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But it's misplaced. Your accomplice has led us right to you." Samuel looked at Isabel, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and regret. He knew he had been betrayed, not by her, but by the circumstances, by the cruel machinations of war. I never meant for this to happen," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his gaze filled with a desperate apology. "It's not your fault," Isabel said, her voice shaking. He twisted everything. My letters, my feelings, he used them against us." Davies laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound. "Clever, aren't I?"
he said.
A few well-placed rumors, a few fabricated messages, a few misinterpreted words, and voila, a perfect trap. He turned to the two American soldiers who had accompanied Isabel, his expression hardening. "As for you," he said, "you're interfering in matters that don't concern you. You'll be dealt with accordingly." He signaled to a group of hidden soldiers, British soldiers, who emerged from the shadows, their weapons trained on the Americans. The situation was dire, the odds stacked against them. Isabel felt a surge of despair. They were trapped, surrounded by enemies, with no hope of escape. But she refused to give up. She had to find a way to expose Davies, to reveal the truth, to save Samuel and herself. Suddenly, she remembered something, a detail, a small piece of information that she had overlooked, a secret that could potentially change everything. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was all she had left. During one of their brief encounters, Samuel had mentioned a childhood friend, someone he had grown up with in America, someone who had also joined the military, someone who was now serving in a high-ranking position in British intelligence. A name he had whispered in passing, a name that had stuck in her memory. "Major Alistair Crawford," Isabel said, her voice loud and clear, her eyes fixed on Davies. "He's a friend of Samuel's. A close friend. From childhood. He knows he's innocent. He'll vouch for him." The name had the desired effect. Davies's expression faltered, his confident facade crumbling for a brief moment. He knew the name. Major Crawford was a powerful figure in British intelligence, a man who could not be easily dismissed. "Crawford?" he said, his voice losing some of its assurance. What do you know about Crawford?" "I know he's Samuel's friend," Isabel said, her voice gaining strength. "And I know he'll expose you for the liar and traitor you are." It was a bluff, a desperate attempt to sow doubt, to create an opportunity. She had no idea if Major Crawford would actually help, if he even remembered Samuel. But it was a chance, a flicker of hope in the darkness. The weight of the secret, the gamble she had taken, hung heavy in the air. The standoff continued, the tension thick and palpable. But the balance of power had shifted, if only slightly. Davies' certainty had been shaken, and a glimmer of uncertainty had crept into his eyes. The outcome remained uncertain, but the possibility of exposure, of truth prevailing, had suddenly become real. Chapter 12. The Dance of Deception. Davies hesitated, his eyes darting between Isabel and the American soldiers, his mind clearly racing. The mention of Major Crawford had thrown him off balance, introducing an element of uncertainty into his carefully orchestrated plan. He couldn't afford to have his actions questioned, his authority challenged. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked its previous conviction. The seed of doubt had been planted, and Isabel could see it taking root. "Am I?" Isabel challenged, her gaze unwavering.
Call him.
"Contact Major Crawford. Let him decide. Let him hear the truth about Samuel, about the evidence you've fabricated." Davies glared at her, his face a mask of anger and frustration. He knew he was in a precarious position. If Isabel was telling the truth, if Major Crawford was indeed a friend of Samuel's, his entire scheme could unravel, exposing him as a traitor and a liar. He turned to one of his men, his voice low and urgent. "Get me a line to headquarters," he said. "I need to speak to Major Crawford. Immediately." The soldier nodded and hurried away, leaving the warehouse in a state of tense anticipation. The silence was broken only by the distant sounds of war, a constant reminder of the larger conflict that raged around them. Isabel stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest, her gaze fixed on Davies. She had played her last card, a desperate gamble that could either save them or condemn them. She had no idea if Major Crawford would believe her, if he would even remember Samuel. Samuel, still tied to the chair, watched the scene unfold, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. He knew the risk Isabel was taking, the danger she had placed herself in. He admired her courage, her unwavering loyalty, but he also feared for her safety. The wait seemed interminable, each passing minute stretching into an eternity. The tension in the warehouse was palpable, the air thick with unspoken anxieties and uncertainties. Finally, the soldier returned, his expression grim. "Major Crawford is on the line, sir," he said to Davies. Davies took a deep breath, his face a mask of forced composure. He picked up the communication device, his voice carefully modulated, attempting to project an air of authority and control. "Major Crawford?"
He said.
"Captain Davies here. I have a situation in Bapalm. A matter of national security." He proceeded to explain his version of events, painting Samuel as a traitor, Isabel as his accomplice, and himself as the vigilant officer uncovering a dangerous conspiracy. He spoke with confidence, carefully omitting any details that might contradict his narrative, weaving a web of lies and deceit. Isabel listened, her heart sinking with each carefully crafted word. Davies was a master manipulator, a skilled liar. He was convincing, persuasive. She feared that Major Crawford would believe him, that her desperate gamble would fail. But then, Davies's expression changed. His confident facade began to crumble, his voice losing its assurance. He listened intently, his face paling, his eyes widening in disbelief. But sir," he stammered, "I have proof." Intercepted messages, eyewitness accounts. He listened again, his body trembling, his hand shaking. He was losing control, his carefully constructed world collapsing around him. Finally, he lowered the communication device, his face ashen, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and defeat. He looked at Isabel, his gaze filled with a grudging respect, a recognition of the truth. "It seems," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I've been misinformed." The dance of deception was over. Major Crawford, it turned out, not only remembered Samuel, but also held him in high regard. He had listened to Davies's claims with skepticism, had conducted his own investigation, and had uncovered the truth that Davies was the traitor, that he had been using his position to sabotage the Allied war effort, feeding false information to the enemy for personal gain. The secret Isabel had revealed, the name she had invoked, had been the key, the catalyst that had exposed Davies's treachery. The weight of that secret, the burden of that knowledge, had finally lifted, revealing a truth far more complex and dangerous than she could have ever imagined. The dance was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Chapter 13. Shadows of the Past. The sudden reversal of fortune was breathtaking. Davies, stripped of his authority and exposed as a traitor, was quickly disarmed and taken into custody by the American soldiers, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. The British soldiers, realizing they had been duped by their commanding officer, surrendered without resistance, their loyalty shattered, their trust betrayed. Samuel, freed from his bonds, looked at Isabel, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and awe. "You saved me," he said, his voice hoarse, his hand reaching out to touch hers. "You saved us all." Isabel shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. It was a gamble," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know if it would work." "It did," Samuel said, his grip tightening on her hand. "You were incredible." The American sergeant approached them, his expression filled with a mixture of relief and admiration. "You two have been through a lot," he said. "We'll get you back to the hospital. You need to rest." They were transported back to the American Mobile Surgical Unit, the scene of chaos and carnage now tinged with a sense of relief and renewed hope. Davies' treachery had been exposed, his network of spies disrupted, and the threat he posed to the Allied war effort neutralized. But the experience had left its mark. The shadows of the past, the trauma of the war, the weight of betrayal, hung heavy in the air. Samuel and Isabel, bound together by their shared ordeal, found themselves drawn even closer, their connection deepened by the crucible of danger and deception. As they sat together in a quiet corner of the hospital tent, Samuel turned to Isabel, his eyes searching hers. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice hesitant, his expression filled with a mixture of guilt and regret. "Something about my past. Something that explains why I was so distant, why I had those episodes." Isabel looked at him, her heart filled with a sense of foreboding. She knew there were secrets, hidden depths to Samuel's character, scars that ran deeper than the physical wounds of war. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the floor, his hands clasped tightly together. "Before the war," he began, his voice low and strained, "I was engaged.
To be married."
Her name was Eleanor. She was everything to me." He paused, his eyes filling with tears, his voice choked with emotion. She died. Of influenza. Just a few months before I was deployed. I couldn't save her. I was a doctor, and I couldn't save her." The revelation hit Isabel with the force of a physical blow. Samuel's grief, his trauma, was not just about the war. It was about a lost love, a future shattered, a burden of guilt he had carried for years. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice filled with compassion. "I'm so sorry, Samuel." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "I blamed myself," he said. "I felt responsible. I shut down. I couldn't let myself feel anything.
The war, it was a way to escape.
To punish myself." His episodes, his moments of disorientation, were not just the result of shell shock, of the trauma of the battlefield. They were manifestations of his unresolved grief, his deep-seated guilt, his inability to forgive himself. The shadows of his past, the ghost of Eleanor, had haunted him, shaping his actions, influencing his decisions. Now, those shadows were finally being brought into the light, revealed in the shared intimacy of their wartime experience. The past was not erased, but its power was diminished, replaced by the potential for healing, for a future built on honesty and understanding. Chapter 14. Echoes in the Ruins. The revelation of Samuel's past, his lost love, and the burden of guilt he carried, created a new layer of understanding between them. Isabel, having experienced her own share of loss and grief, felt a deep empathy for Samuel, a connection forged not just by their shared wartime experiences, but by the universal pain of losing someone you loved. They spent the following days talking, sharing their stories, their memories, their fears. They found solace in each other's company, a comfort in the shared understanding of their respective traumas. They returned to the ruined church, the place where their connection had first been rekindled, the place where they had shared their most vulnerable moments. The church, though scarred and broken, felt different now. It was no longer just a symbol of devastation, a reminder of the destructive power of war. It was a sanctuary, a place of healing, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. As they sat together amidst the rubble, the sunlight filtering through the shattered windows, Samuel turned to Isabel, his eyes filled with a tenderness she hadn't seen before. "Thank you," he said, his voice soft, his hand reaching out to touch hers. For listening. For understanding. For not giving up on me." Isabel smiled, her eyes meeting his.
"You don't have to thank me," she said.
I understand. More than you know." She shared her own stories, her memories of her father, her brother, her fiancé, the losses that had shaped her life, the grief that had threatened to consume her. She spoke of the letters she had written to Samuel, the unsent words that had poured out her heart, her longing, her hope. "Those letters," Samuel said, his voice filled with emotion.
They saved me.
They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that there was still something to live for." They sat in silence for a moment, their hands clasped together, their eyes locked in a silent exchange of gratitude, of understanding, of love. The echoes of the past, the ghosts of their lost loved ones, seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the present moment, by the fragile hope of a future together. But the war was not over. The distant rumble of artillery, the ever-present threat of danger, served as a constant reminder of the precariousness of their situation. They knew their time together might be limited, that the future was uncertain. "What will you do?" Isabel asked, her voice hesitant, her eyes searching his. When the war is over." Samuel hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. He had been so focused on surviving, on escaping his past, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the future. I don't know," he said finally. I haven't made any plans. I thought I didn't have a future." "You do," Isabel said, her voice firm, her hand squeezing his. "We do. Together." The words hung in the air, a bold declaration, a fragile promise. They were surrounded by ruins, by the devastation of war, but within that desolate landscape, a new hope had blossomed, a love forged in the crucible of shared experience, of mutual understanding, of unwavering support. The echoes in the ruins were no longer just sounds of loss and despair, but whispers of a future, of a possibility, of a love that had defied the odds. It remained to be seen whether that love would survive the trials to come, but for now it was enough. The echoes of the past are fading, but they have made their bond stronger. Chapter 15. The Price of Freedom. The tentative hope that had blossomed between Samuel and Isabel was soon tested by the harsh realities of war. Samuel's unit received orders to move to a new sector, a region where the fighting was particularly fierce, where the Allied forces were preparing for a major offensive. The news filled Isabel with a familiar dread, a fear that had become a constant companion throughout the war. She knew the dangers Samuel faced, the risks he took every day, the ever-present threat of loss. "When do you leave?" she asked, her voice trembling, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice tight with regret, his eyes meeting hers. "At dawn." The word dawn resonated with a bittersweet irony. It was at dawn that they had shared their most intimate moments, their secret rendezvous in the ruined church. Now, dawn marked their separation, their return to the brutal realities of the conflict. They spent their remaining hours together, cherishing every moment, savoring the fleeting connection that had sustained them through so much darkness. They spoke of the future, of their hopes and dreams, of the possibility of a life together after the war. But the unspoken fear, the uncertainty of their situation, hung heavy in the air. They knew their promises, their dreams, might be shattered by the cruel realities of war, that their love might be another casualty of the conflict. As the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Samuel prepared to depart. He stood before Isabel, his uniform dusty and worn, his face etched with fatigue, but his eyes filled with a tenderness that belied the harshness of his surroundings. "I'll come back," he said, his voice firm, his hand reaching out to cup her face. "I promise you, I'll come back to you." Isabel nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, her heart aching with a mixture of love and fear. "I'll be waiting," she said, her voice trembling. "Always." They embraced, a long, desperate embrace, a silent exchange of promises, of hopes, of fears. It was a moment of profound intimacy, a connection that transcended the physical, a bond forged in the crucible of shared experience. Then he was gone. Samuel disappeared into the ranks of soldiers, his figure swallowed by the morning mist, leaving Isabel standing alone, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. The following weeks were a torment of waiting and uncertainty. Isabel continued her duties at the hospital, tending to the wounded, her hands moving with practiced skill, but her mind constantly elsewhere, preoccupied with thoughts of Samuel. She received one brief, cryptic message from him, a few hastily scrawled words on a scrap of paper, assuring her that he was alive, that he was thinking of her. But the message also spoke of intense fighting, of heavy losses, of the constant danger that surrounded him. Then the news arrived. The major offensive had begun. The Allied forces were pushing forward, but at a terrible cost. The casualties were mounting, the hospital overflowing with wounded soldiers, their bodies bearing the horrific marks of the brutal conflict. And then the silence. Days turned into weeks, and there was no word from Samuel. No messages, no rumors, no sign of life. Isabel's hope began to dwindle, replaced by a growing fear, a sense of dread that she couldn't shake. She clung to his promise, to the memory of their last embrace, as a lifeline, a source of strength in the face of overwhelming despair. But the silence was deafening, the uncertainty unbearable. The price of freedom, the cost of the war, was becoming increasingly clear, and Isabel feared that she, and her love for Samuel, would be among the casualties. The promise echoed, but the silence threatened to consume her. Chapter 16. A Love Forbidden. The silence stretched on, weeks turning into a month, the absence of any news about Samuel growing more ominous with each passing day. Isabel continued her work at the hospital, but her heart was heavy with dread, her hope dwindling with every sunrise that brought no word from him. She moved through her duties like a ghost, her spirit dulled by grief and the gnawing fear that he was lost. Then, one evening, a new patient arrived at the hospital, an American soldier, badly wounded, his face covered in bandages, his body ravaged by shrapnel. He was delirious, muttering incoherently, his words a jumble of fragmented memories and battlefield horrors. As Isabel tended to him, changing his dressings, administering morphine, she heard him whisper a name. A familiar name. Samuel. Her heart leaped with a mixture of hope and fear. She leaned closer, her ear close to his lips, trying to decipher his mumbled words. "Captain Hayes," he whispered, his voice weak and strained. "Brave man saved many, but trapped ambush." The words sent a chill down Isabel's spine. Ambush.
Trapped.
The worst of her fears seemed to be confirmed. But there was a flicker of hope. He had saved many. He was brave. He might still be alive. She questioned the soldier relentlessly, trying to extract more information, but his responses were fragmented, unreliable, his mind clouded by pain and trauma. He spoke of a fierce battle, of heavy losses, of Samuel leading a desperate charge, of a sudden explosion. Isabel pieced together the fragments, the whispers, the rumors, and a terrifying picture began to emerge. Samuel's unit had been ambushed, caught in a deadly trap, possibly orchestrated by remnants of Davies's network, seeking revenge for his capture. Samuel, in a desperate attempt to save his men, had led a counterattack, a heroic but ultimately futile effort. The soldier's condition worsened, his breathing becoming shallow and labored. He slipped into unconsciousness, his whispers fading into silence. Isabel stayed by his side, holding his hand, her heart aching with a mixture of grief and a desperate, flickering hope. Then, she discovered something, a small, leather-bound book, tucked inside the soldier's uniform pocket. It was a journal, filled with entries written in a familiar hand. Samuel's hand. She opened the journal, her hands trembling, her eyes scanning the pages. The entries were brief, cryptic, written in the midst of battle, but they told a story of courage, of sacrifice, of a love that transcended the horrors of war. The last entry, written just hours before the ambush, was addressed to her. Isabel, my love, if you're reading this, it means I may not make it back. But know this, I love you. I have always loved you. From the moment I saw you across that crowded hospital ward, I knew. You are my hope, my reason, my everything. If I die, know that I died loving you. Tears streamed down Isabel's face as she read the words, her heart breaking with a grief so profound it threatened to consume her. But amidst the grief, there was something else, a sense of peace, a feeling of closure. He had loved her. He had died loving her. But there was also something unsettling. In a different part of the journal, in a section detailing a past mission, Samuel wrote about a French woman, a member of the local resistance he had worked closely with. He detailed an intimacy and closeness that seemed more than a working relationship, a forbidden relationship. Her joy over his declaration was tempered. Samuel's past may have held even more secrets. Was his declaration to her the whole truth? Chapter 17. The Reckoning of Duty. The discovery of Samuel's journal, with its declaration of love intertwined with hints of a forbidden relationship, left Isabel reeling. The joy of knowing his true feelings was tempered by a nagging doubt, a shadow cast by the mention of the French resistance fighter, Annalise. She reread the passages, searching for clues, for answers, for a way to reconcile the conflicting emotions that surged within her. The journal entries about Annalise were brief, discreet, but they spoke of a shared danger, a mutual respect, a closeness that hinted at something more than just a professional collaboration. Annalise risked everything tonight. She led us through the German lines, her knowledge of the terrain invaluable. We owe her our lives. Spent the evening with Annalise, planning the next operation. She's remarkable, brave, intelligent, resourceful, and beautiful. The word beautiful stung, a sharp pang of jealousy piercing through Isabel's grief. She knew she shouldn't feel this way, that Samuel was likely gone, that his past shouldn't matter. But it did. It mattered because it challenged the image she had of him, the perfect love she had built in her mind, the hope she had clung to during the long, silent weeks. She decided she needed answers. She needed to know the truth about Samuel's relationship with Annalise, to understand the full context of his past, to reconcile the conflicting emotions that raged within her. She sought out Madame Dubois, the head nurse, her mentor and confidant. Madame Dubois, with her vast network of contacts and her intimate knowledge of the war, might be able to shed some light on the situation. Madame Dubois, Isabel said, her voice hesitant, her hand clutching the journal. I need your help. I found this. It belonged to Samuel. She explained the situation, the journal entries, the mention of Annalise, the doubts that plagued her. Madame Dubois listened patiently, her expression softening with compassion as she heard Isabel's story. Annalise Dubois, Madame Dubois said, her voice thoughtful, a flicker of recognition in her eyes. Yes, I know of her. She's my niece. My sister's daughter. The revelation took Isabel by surprise. Annalise was related to Madame Dubois? It was a connection she hadn't anticipated, a twist that added another layer of complexity to the situation. She's a remarkable young woman, Madame Dubois continued. Brave, resourceful, dedicated to the cause. She's been working with the resistance for years, risking her life to help the Allied forces. Did she know Samuel? Isabel asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding in her chest. Madame Dubois hesitated, her gaze shifting away from Isabel's. Yes, she said finally. They worked together. On several dangerous missions. They were close. How close? Isabel pressed, her voice trembling, her eyes searching Madame Dubois's face. Madame Dubois sighed, her expression filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding.
They were comrades, she said.
Bound together by shared danger, by mutual respect, by a common cause. There was an attraction, a connection. But it was wartime, Isabel. Things happen. Lines blur. She paused, her hand reaching out to touch Isabel's arm. Samuel was a good man, Isabel, she said. He was conflicted. He had a lot of pain. From his past. From the war. He cared for Annalise. But he also loved you. I saw it in his eyes. I heard it in his voice. The words offered some comfort, a partial resolution to the conflicting emotions that had tormented Isabel. Samuel had been caught in a complex situation, torn between duty, attraction, and a love that had blossomed amidst the horrors of war. He had been human, flawed, vulnerable. The reckoning of his duty, his past, and his feelings was a painful but necessary process. Isabel knew she could never fully understand the complexities of Samuel's wartime experiences, the choices he had made, the relationships he had formed. But she could accept them. She could forgive him. And she could cherish the love he had declared for her, the love that had transcended the boundaries of war, of duty, of forbidden desires. The truth was complex, but it ultimately reinforced the depth of his character, the struggle he faced, and the love he ultimately chose. Chapter 18. Beyond the Trenches. The war continued, its relentless rhythm of violence and loss seemingly unaffected by the personal dramas that unfolded within its vast, chaotic landscape. But for Isabel, the world had shifted. The revelation of Samuel's complex past, his relationship with Annalise, had brought a sense of closure, a painful but necessary understanding of the man she loved. She received confirmation, through Madame Du Bois's contacts, that Samuel had indeed perished in the ambush. He had died a hero, saving the lives of many of his men, his bravery earning him a posthumous Medal of Honor. Isabel mourned his loss, her grief profound and all-consuming, but it was a grief tempered by understanding, by acceptance, by the knowledge that he had loved her, that he had died fighting for a cause he believed in. She continued her work at the hospital, tending to the wounded, her hands moving with a newfound purpose, her heart filled with a quiet determination to honor Samuel's memory, to carry on his legacy of compassion and service. Then one day a letter arrived, not from Samuel, but from Annalise. The letter was written in French, a language Isabel had learned during her time in France. It was a heartfelt expression of grief, of gratitude, of a shared loss. Mademoiselle Hartley, the letter began, I write to you with a heavy heart. I have learned of the death of Captain Hayes, a man I admired, respected, and loved. He was a hero, a true inspiration to us all. He spoke of you often, with a tenderness and a devotion that was unmistakable. He cherished you, mademoiselle. He held you in his heart, as a beacon of hope, a symbol of a future he dreamed of. Annalise went on to describe her relationship with Samuel, their shared dangers, their mutual respect, their brief but intense connection. She acknowledged the complexities of their situation, the forbidden nature of their attraction, the limitations imposed by the war. We knew our time together was limited, she wrote, that the war might separate us, or worse. But we cherished every moment, every stolen embrace, every whispered conversation. He spoke of you always asking for forgiveness that he should be so lucky during a time like this. He was a good man, Mademoiselle Hartley. A man torn between duty, loyalty, and a love that transcended the boundaries of war. The letter ended with a gesture of solidarity, of shared grief, of a mutual understanding that transcended the complexities of their situation. I mourn his loss, as you do, mademoiselle. But I also celebrate his life, his courage, his compassion. He will live on in our memories, in our hearts, as a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of love. The letter brought tears to Isabel's eyes, but they were tears of healing, of acceptance, of a shared understanding that transcended the boundaries of language, of culture, of personal loss. The war finally ended, the guns falling silent, the world slowly beginning to heal from the wounds of the conflict. Isabel returned to England, to a life forever changed by her wartime experiences. She carried with her the memories of Samuel, of Annalise, of the countless soldiers she had cared for, the lives she had touched. She found solace in service, in continuing the work she had begun during the war. She became a nurse in a small, rural hospital, tending to the needs of her community, her heart filled with a quiet compassion, a deep understanding of the human condition. She never forgot Samuel. She cherished his memory, his love, his sacrifice. She moved beyond the trenches, both literally and metaphorically, carrying with her the lessons she had learned, the love she had found, the strength she had discovered amidst the horrors of war. The future was uncertain, but she faced it with courage, with resilience, with a heart filled with hope, a hope born from the ashes of loss and despair. Life went on. She found peace. Chapter 19. The Unveiling of Truth. Life settled into a quiet rhythm for Isabel. The bustling wartime hospitals were replaced by the gentle hum of a rural clinic, the screams of the wounded by the murmurs of everyday ailments. Yet, the echoes of the war, Samuel's memory, and the lingering questions about Annalise remained. One crisp autumn afternoon, years after the war's end, a package arrived. It was postmarked from France, and the handwriting on the address, though unfamiliar, felt strangely significant. Isabel's heart quickened as she carefully opened the package. Inside, nestled among layers of tissue paper, was a small, intricately carved wooden box. It was beautiful, crafted with a skill and artistry that spoke of a deep personal connection. Accompanying the box was a letter, again written in French. Mademoiselle Hartley, the letter began, I hope this finds you well. Years have passed since the war that changed us all. I have often thought of you, of Samuel, of the shared grief that bound us together, despite the complexities of our situation. It was from Annalise. I am writing to you now because I have something to share. Something that belonged to Samuel, something he entrusted to me, with instructions to deliver it to you should he not return. Isabel's hands trembled as she continued reading. He spoke of you often, mademoiselle. Of his love for you, of his regret for the pain he may have caused, of his hope for a future that was stolen from him. He wanted you to know the truth, the whole truth, about his past, about his feelings, about the choices he made. Isabel carefully opened the wooden box. Inside, she found a collection of items, photographs, letters, a small, silver locket. The photographs showed Samuel at various stages of his life, a young boy with a mischievous grin, a teenager on the cusp of adulthood, a young man in his medical student uniform, his eyes filled with ambition and hope. There were also photos of him with Eleanor, his fiancée, their faces radiant with love, their future seemingly bright and boundless. And then there were the photos of him with Annalise. Pictures taken during the war, amidst the ruins of bombed-out buildings, in hidden resistance hideouts, their faces etched with the strain of constant danger, their eyes reflecting a shared understanding, a mutual respect, a connection forged in the crucible of conflict. The letters were from Samuel to Eleanor, written before the war, filled with expressions of love, of devotion, of plans for a future together. They were heartbreaking to read, a testament to a love cut short by tragedy, a future that never came to be. There were also a few letters from Samuel to Annalise, written during the war. These letters were different, filled with a sense of urgency, of shared purpose, of a connection forged in the face of death. They spoke of respect, of admiration, of a bond that transcended the boundaries of conventional relationships. But it was the locket that held the most profound revelation. Isabel carefully opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside there were 2 miniature portraits. One was of Eleanor, her beautiful face smiling serenely. The other was of Isabel. The portrait of Isabel was a small, faded photograph taken during their brief encounter at her father's deathbed, years before the war. It was a picture she had given Samuel, a token of gratitude, a remembrance of a shared moment of grief. The unveiling of the truth, the contents of the box, the letters, the photographs, the locket, brought a sense of peace, of understanding, of a love that had transcended time, distance, and the complexities of war. Samuel had carried her image, her memory, with him throughout his life, a constant reminder of a connection that had begun in sorrow and blossomed in the midst of conflict. He had loved Eleanor, he had cared for Annalise, but he had also loved her, Isabel, with a depth and a constancy that defied the chaos and uncertainty of war. The complete truth was a tapestry of love, loss, and unwavering devotion, finally revealed, bringing closure and a profound sense of peace. Chapter 20. A New Dawn. The years that followed were marked by a quiet contentment for Isabel. The revelation of Samuel's enduring love, the tangible evidence contained within the wooden box, had brought a sense of peace, of closure, that had eluded her for so long. She continued her work as a nurse, her compassion deepened by her own experiences, her heart filled with a quiet strength born from loss and resilience. She remained in contact with Annalise, their correspondence a testament to a shared grief, a mutual respect, and a bond forged by their connection to Samuel. They wrote of their lives, their work, their memories of the man they had both loved, their letters a bridge across the distance, a testament to the enduring power of human connection. One spring morning, many years after receiving the package from Annalise, Isabel found herself drawn to a small, local church, its architecture reminiscent of the ruined sanctuary where she and Samuel had shared their stolen moments during the war. The sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows cast colorful patterns on the stone floor, creating an atmosphere of peace and tranquility. As she sat in a quiet pew, her thoughts drifted back to Samuel, to their brief but intense love, to the sacrifices he had made, to the legacy he had left behind. She remembered his words, his promises, his unwavering belief in a better future. A sense of peace washed over her, a feeling of gratitude for the life she had lived, for the love she had experienced, for the strength she had discovered within herself. She had faced loss, grief, betrayal, and uncertainty, but she had emerged from the darkness, her spirit unbroken, her heart filled with a quiet hope. As she rose to leave, she noticed a young couple standing near the altar, their faces radiant with love, their eyes filled with the promise of a future together. They were holding hands, their fingers intertwined, their gazes locked in a silent exchange of devotion. Isabel smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. She saw in them a reflection of her own past, of the love she had shared with Samuel, of the hope that had sustained her through the darkest of times. She knew their journey would not be easy, that life would inevitably bring challenges, losses, and uncertainties. But she also knew that love, true love, had the power to endure, to heal, to transform. She walked out of the church, the sunlight warm on her face, the air filled with the scent of spring blossoms. The world was a different place now, the scars of war slowly fading, replaced by a new generation, a new hope, a new dawn. Isabel looked up at the sky, a clear, boundless expanse of blue, and whispered a silent thank you, a tribute to Samuel, to Annalise, to all those who had fought, who had loved, who had sacrificed for a better future. She had lived a full life, a life touched by tragedy, but also by profound love and enduring hope. A new dawn had broken, not just for the world, but for Isabel herself. The echoes of the past remained, but they were no longer sounds of pain and regret, but whispers of remembrance, of gratitude, of a love that had transcended time, distance, and the ravages of war. The cycle of life continued, and she was at peace. Epilogue. Decades later, an elderly Isabel sat on the porch of her small cottage, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the well-tended garden. Her hands, gnarled with age, gently held a worn, wooden box. It was the same box Annalise had sent her years ago, the box containing the tangible remnants of Samuel's love, his life, his sacrifice. Her granddaughter, a young woman named Elodie, sat beside her, her eyes filled with curiosity and a deep respect for the woman who had lived through so much, who had loved so deeply, who had emerged from the darkness with a strength and a grace that inspired everyone she met. "Grandma," Elodie asked softly, her gaze fixed on the box, "tell me about him again." "About Samuel." Isabel smiled, a gentle, knowing smile that reflected a lifetime of memories, of love, of loss, of resilience. She opened the box, revealing the contents, the photographs, the letters, the small, silver locket. "He was a good man, Elodie," she said, her voice soft but clear, her eyes filled with a distant, yet vivid, memory. "A brave man. A man who loved deeply, who sacrificed everything for what he believed in." She picked up the locket, opening it to reveal the two miniature portraits: Eleanor, Samuel's first love, and Isabel herself, a young woman captured in a fleeting moment of shared grief, years before the war that would change their lives forever. "He loved two women in his life," she continued, "each in a different time. Each a reflection of the man, Samuel. He carried that love to the end." Elodie looked at the portraits, her eyes filled with wonder. She had heard the stories countless times, but they never ceased to amaze her, to move her, to inspire her. "He was a hero, Grandma," Elodie said, her voice filled with admiration. Isabel nodded.
"Yes," she said, "he was."
"But he was also human. He made mistakes. He had regrets.
He was complex.
Like all of us." She closed the locket, her fingers gently tracing its outline.
"The war, it changed us all," she said.
"It took so much from us, but it also gave us something. It taught us the value of love, of loyalty, of sacrifice. It taught us the importance of holding on to hope, even in the darkest of times." She looked at Elodie, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "Never forget, Elodie," she said. "Love is the strongest force in the world. It can conquer anything, even death." As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the horizon, Isabel closed the box, her heart filled with a sense of peace, of gratitude, of a love that had endured, that had transcended time, distance, and the ravages of war. The story of Samuel, of Annalise, of Isabel was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the enduring power of love, to the hope that always remains, even in the face of unimaginable loss. The story was complete. She smiled. The end.